it's in August. Birth class? Oh, really? I thought the
I need
joke
to
was
find
the
somebody that
bushes.
looks at me like looks okay.
Karen, right?
Yeah, Derek did that. But also you're in this too.
I don't even recognize myself. I can't believe that's me.
Can you move diagonal?
Yeah. But you can't go there.
I'm not the one.
Oh, you're the.
But
He won't do it.
they're gonna
You got
kill my
this.
horse.
No, he won't. He can't do that.
Yeah.
Because you have this work here.
So,
He would be
okay, so
putting
it's
himself
my
in.
move. What should I do? If I do this, he kills me here. If I do this, I kind of want to move the tower, but
Who are you playing with?
I know. Are these all his wings?
yeah, but this is mine.
Ooh. What are you asking my advice for?
Because I'm stuck, but he's gonna take my horse.
But he can't because this guy. He can't put himself in danger.
No, but it's my move now.
Right. I don't think, but all I'm getting at is I don't think you gotta move that.
You wouldn't move the horse nor the tower?
I think it's okay. I don't move that.
Okay, so if I move something from here, and he's gonna, he can't go back here and take it back.
No. Because this guy, he can't put himself in check, right?
Oh yeah, right. Because of that. Yeah, you're right. So I should take the advantage and try to move this up. What?
Oh, you can't. Oh,
yeah,
no.
I'm just like this. Like if I take this and I like.
You should play with Pegasus.
Oh, he plays?
He's the master.
Oh, I said, I'm not good at this. Oh, if I do this and then next move is kill this stuff.
Yeah, but then he'll take you.
Oh yeah, right.
Or
So what can I do? Nothing here, nothing here. I can go in front. I can move my horse. I feel like I should attack more.
mm-hmm.
So I think I go here and then I go up. Yeah. That's my move.
Do they play like pretty
Yeah,
immediately?
I
Like in
always-
real time?
Yeah. Not in real time, like 15 20 minutes.
Social chat. I love the weather.
Yeah. Have you not seen on social chat?
I don't know which one this is, do you? Also, Buddy.
Ooh.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the graduation.
Who did?
Who's this?
My arm.
No, I think the last one said electrical. Very rare.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and even at freaking. It's like feel like the signs are the class.
Yeah, I don't think I have some undergrad.
It's a way to get late. You have to like walk a shade, steps.
What is that? What is that? It's a James Ryder, Is it Emma?
Yeah.
Where is she? Did she make this bag?
She's not.
She is? Oh, I wonder if she'll be there.
I don't know if she got what she did.
Yeah.
You what eat on Sunday?
Yes.
This is Julia.
What?
We do.
Yeah.
It's there.
No, it's not a good time.
Is that the copy? Of course it is. Oh my god. Just slowly seeing that. So cute.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There's pictures of this person surviving 25 straight in
You don't have this.
No.
Wow.
He doesn't. Yeah.
That's what you're trying to survive.
So fun. Should I see good Sunday after it?
Yeah.
Should I see good Sunday after it?
After this?
Yeah.
Oh. Is that a Yeah, yeah, yeah. But usually you're right, that's true. Yeah. It's the plastic. No, I love it. Yeah, yeah, that's yeah, yeah.
That's an interesting present.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
A lot to do.
That's okay. Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
Oh, where's the kid? Is it? Might also be-
Yeah, I think that's another thing. So this is
Yeah, but it's just, it's very concerned about this.
Yeah, this is the problem.
I think so. I thought it was a dedicated exhibition. But I think it would be good for Sorry. I mean, it's by House and Britain.
Yeah.
So it relates to this.
Good afternoon, the 14th.
No, Sam, we've got nothing.
That's exactly what I think. You must be. She said she felt like that was one she got a job.
Oh,
She
yeah.
showed somebody you got 1,000.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dickens on
Obviously, that's a bad one.
You will start shortly. Door.
When she was thinking, the precious is like, yeah, yeah.
But also like
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
But
They're not frozen.
I'll stay awake.
That melody is like,
Yeah.
triggers wakefulness.
He decided to leave the house. Saleh Abu Mohsen arrived home.
I need my pen to get David flashlight. You have another one?
One pencil one.
A pencil for free.
Okay, good. Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Ines Medina, and I'm a student at the MA Creating Collections here at Chelsea. And we're going to have today talk from Ariel Caine of Forensic Architecture about CIVIC Ariel Vision, which is part of the public program that we have around the exhibition Observer, which is an exhibition that we articulated around John Nathan's archive, and which takes a look at distant perspective. And that's why we have this talk today, to try and consider distant perspective Ariel vision and take it to the 21st century, essentially, and understand what kind of issues and what kind of questions there are surrounding it. So I just have to tell you that there are 4 fire exits, so 2 here and 2 on the top, at the top of this room. And also we're going to have some questions after the talk, so you have a chance to ask some questions to Ariel if you wish. And without further ado, we might begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi everyone. Thanks for being here. Thank you for inviting. And I'll talk, and I have a kind of obviously the presentation, but if you want to ask me in the middle, stop me, ask questions, you can also do that while I'm going. So feel free to ask any questions during. And obviously there's time, as said, for questions at the end. And yeah, definitely welcome a discussion. So I mean, my talk really basically looks at, or starts with the question: who owns the skies? How does this heightened air and verticality have historically kind of been associated? It's been kind of written widely.
Can you just talk up a bit?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Maybe you needed a microphone.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and speak up, and do tell me. Well, yeah, you can come closer because all this is empty, so definitely feel free to come closer. My voice is very soft. I'll try and project as much as possible. The aerial perspective, the view from above, has been associated historically and definitely increasingly over the kind of as technology developed with the perspective of the sovereign. And if you look at this sovereign, the perspective of control, mapping, things to do with many times infliction of violence and infliction of control, ownership, sovereignty, etc. But when you look closely and start dissecting it a bit more, you also notice that there are, historically, you can also divide that into 2 separate types of mapping, or 2 types of aerial vision. One which is perspectival, connected more with the view from a single point, or again, historically you could associate with the eye of the ruler. The magisterial gaze is one kind of name that was given to it. The single viewpoint from which knowledge is derived. You have also another type of perspective, which is that of the map, which is devoid of a source, of one source, but it's a kind of view that is flattened, it's objectivized radically, and you have 2 different modes of vision that are associated with these 2 types of aerial perspective. And increasingly, the perspectival one is more associated with, as I said, the single viewpoint, the conventional perspective, the flattening of volume into one kind of gaze through a vanishing point. You have the other kind of mode of survey, which starts in the 20th century to go also through aerial perspectives into map making using aerial mosaics. This is an image from the year, but it's around the First World War. Sorry for, I should look that up. But you also have very early on, this is from 1685, an illustration by a thinker called Johann Sohn. Into research into perspectives and how you can actually, how this single viewpoint can also start to be dismantled, and one volume, one object in the world can actually be comprised and looked at through different perspectives and broken up. And this kind of movement between a single viewpoint that goes through perspective and the flattening of volume into a flat representation, and on the other hand, the attempt to capture that volume and also reproduce it as something that's started in these times. You can also see it in Ariel's etching of going from a single object onto a flat plane. But what we increasingly see is an attempt to invert that type of perspective from flattening of surface into a planar representation, and turning viewpoints, multi-viewpoints, into projective entities, and actually produce space through multiple projections, which is what goes on over here. And in a way, in the advent of computation and computational vision, especially since around the 1970s, we can see that there's an acceleration in in a conflation between these two modes of vision: the flattening mode of vision, the singular perspectival viewpoint, which could be from the air or from the ground, and forming a new type of image or image space and mode of survey that actually brings the two together. So bring together survey, mapping, and perspectival imaging to actually produce not a flattening of space, but a projective space that's recreating volume virtually or sculpturally. And that then entails, once we get deeper and deeper into this third mode of representation or third mode of capture, which is this projective type of vision, we are moving into a mode that can combine the view from above on the one hand, the survey, and a spatial navigational entity through which you start to investigate and capture the world. And remote sensing in general has and the mode of survey that first began with map making and through different colonial projects have increasingly turned into, on the one hand, to increased resolution, which we definitely see throughout the 20th century. There's the 21st, you have a arms race in resolution, getting more and more access, but we're also getting into a fusion of the two perspectives of the aerial and the ground perspective, and a move from a observational type of image, which is more to do with the map, so not one perspective, but actually a navigational mode of experiencing imaging. So we have a spatialization of imaging, which is what I described first, and then the introduction of navigation as a mode through which to interrogate imagery. So we're not scanning images as a flat representation, record, abstraction, but we're actually moving into an image space that needs the eye to move in space. It's not an immobile eye, or what's called, I forgot the name of the painter, but the paralyzed cyclope, I think. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So we have navigation and spatialization of imaging as a mode through which to interact with space. Now, forensic architecture, of which I'm part of, began to took upon itself as a kind of viewpoint to introduce or to read images and to read architectural space, remote sensing through this architectural understanding that material is a sensor through which you, that's a material sensor that records whatever types of violence or whatever types of interactions occurred on it or around it. And images and types of media as well are recording both their own metadata as what type of lens created, what type of altitude the plane was flying, how the haze between the plane and the ground was influencing the type of image that was received, what kind of paper is printed on, the resolution of the sensors. All these kinds of things are influencing the way that an image is recorded, and then it's imprinted in the image. But also, aside from that, you also have the different types of material on the ground that's being recorded. You have the type of politics around the production of the image, who controls whatever satellite, what are the orbits that it's going around in, when can the satellite be shut down, for instance. So in the event of the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2011, 10 or 11, for months, satellite imagery over the Gulf of Mexico was basically shut off for any public investigative inquiry. So you could get no high resolution images of what's happening on the ground. How is the oil spill kind of expanding? What are the damages to the vegetation, to the wildlife? And this was obviously in combination with the US and the different corporations, that's BP to start with. And there are many different examples like that. I'll show later on an example from Israel-Palestine in terms of how resolution is lowered intentionally to obscure and obfuscate different types of evidence on the ground. And there are multiple examples. So you have different type of politics that embed themselves in the actual material of the image, of the evidence, and in the way that we view the images. And forensic architecture basically looks at the material remains of media and of objects, people, environments, and tries to reverse engineer those bits of evidence that we record through different types of skills, whether it's image making capabilities, architectural sensitivity, conceptual tools, concepts that we develop. And using those skills, we basically try to produce evidence on behalf of civil society in cases of human rights, environmental events of abuse and violence. Now, I wanted to start with, I'm going to kind of show a few, kind of walk through three main test cases through which I wanted to kind of show this change. And the first one is the architectural image complex, which is a way to move from the aerial view and how that aerial view is turned into a 3D model, through which we then interrogate and read and understand social media that's coming out of a site of violence. One of the issues that came up quite early when we try to understand events as they unfold, when information from the ground is coming from multiple sources, sometimes 10 or 12, but sometimes thousands of different sources. You don't have a clear official line coming out, or sometimes there are multiple official lines that try to obfuscate, again, the narrative of what's going on. In order to read and locate and understand the way that different images can tell a story, you need to actually position them in space and use the combination of the map view and the embedded or embodied view to actually navigate and use the 3D model as an editing machine. So instead of moving from one clip, cutting, moving to another clip, in Caine. From using montage, we actually move into navigation to actually unfold and make connections between different image sources. And I'll actually lower the. So this is the case of Israel's attack on Gaza in 2014. In Rafia, in the southern area of Gaza, where Israel was bombing along the multiple places. We were working with Amnesty to actually kind of situate, to try to tell the story of what was unfolding in this stuff.
They decided to leave the house in two groups. Abu Mohsen reached the Mashrua Amir.
Just for a second. So what we had was a satellite image, relatively up to date. And we got also, in the end, images from the day itself of the attack. There are multiple bombings all across Gaza. You have thousands of images from social media, testimonies that are collected on the ground, and you need to now start making sense of where things were located, where were filmed, where were evidence filmed. How can you actually synchronize a lot of these events that don't have metadata as regards to time and location, and bring all that together in a way that could actually tell a story that's then elucidates what we see in the aerial satellite view. And this is an example of what I meant before about the architectural image complex and the specialization of the navigating through images. And play a short clip of this.
And saw burnt cars.
بس مشيت متر ورا الشحن المحروق اتفاجأت بأربع دبابات قدام معسكر الجيش المعروف عنا بتكن سعد صايل أطلقت علينا النار.
One of his daughters, Asel Abu Mohsen, had stayed behind with a neighbor and fell. They later found out that she had died. This video, taken close to the border crossing with Egypt, shows the same road being targeted while civilians were fleeing. The Abu Mohsen family later arrived at the Al-Najjar hospital. The area south of the hospital, towards the Al-Najjar roundabout, was being shelled at 10:22. At 10:55, people gathering seeking protection next to the hospital took these photographs showing the strike on the Tanur neighborhood. The same bombing was recorded from different perspectives. We can see civilians fleeing northwards. Close by, another video recorded by a civilian shows the result of an attack on a motorcycle. This happened roughly 10 minutes before the bombing of the Tanur neighborhood. At this time, Inam Ouda Avid bin Hamad and her children were at her brother's house on Oruba Street. They decided to flee because the shelling became more intense.
طلعنا الحين يعني فيش 6 بيوت الحين صعب انكتب تعسفل صراحه من شده القذائف لانه انت ممكن انت تقطعك تيجي قذيفه تقسم فلسطين عن جد.
Inam was hit by a column of a building knocked out due to the Tanur bombing and lost consciousness. Her son died in this strike. When she awoke, she found her daughter and her niece next to her and made her way to Bilbesi Street, where Dr. Bilbesi was offering first aid.
اجت الساعة خبطت قدامها صاروخ زنان عشان تراجع 9 فينا وقعدنا يمكن نص ساعة واحنا بننزل.
Later that afternoon, another ambulance was struck by a drone close to Al-Birwa Al-Taqwa Mosque. The shrapnel found on site confirms both Hellfire missile from a drone as well as gravity bomb, likely from a jet, were used. Testimony confirmed multiple attacks on the mosques and on the ambulances.
This is a very short clip from a law investigation. I mean, all the investigations we have are available on the website. As part of, I'll talk about this a bit later, but all our investigations are put out, available as reports on the website with clearly outlining the way we arrive at information, how everything is constructed, what the source media, etc. Well, I'll talk about that. Soon. What I wanted to show here is that from a lot of information and a bit of, you could say to an extent, chaos or disorientation on the ground, you have a very remote image that you get from satellite, which then you need to start teasing out. And in order to tell a story, as an organization that, as a coalition of organizations that are not the state of Israel or any government or official even UN or kind of official body, you need to use whatever is available in order to start producing your analysis. And in order to do that, one of the ways that we found useful is to network or treat all these types of different evidence as a network of different knowledge points that you need to start meshing and playing one against the other. And using in this case, the satellite image to inform the modeling. We model the buildings using different types of features that we see in the buildings themselves, in the image. So shadow height can tell you about the height of a building, shadow length can tell you about the height of a building, things like that. We build the structures, we then position, look in the images that we get to actually position them and locate them on the streets, project them onto the 3D model, and then use the 3D model itself as a navigational tool to create the narrative. And once you do that, you can start understand where people were standing, what are the distances between one event and the other, how the real time of the event can play out or inform how the building of the production of media, and how the media can then inform you what the real time events were on the ground. I'll move on to a different type of use. Still in
This set of
case.
photographs shows 3 consecutive strikes.
And really the question was, how do we
We locate the
identify,
strikes on the satellite image where we see
how do we
large
identify
craters.
the different locations of the bombings? How can we see where the bombings are?
Remote sensing analysis reveals vegetation destroyed or damaged. This sensor helps detect many more bomb craters from airborne strikes, as well as artillery strikes. There would have been
And one option was to just scour the image and start looking for places where you see a hole, or it's a building, comparing before and after images. But another use that we found was to use the normalized difference vegetation index, which means how in satellite imagery you get what's called multispectral bands. So the image isn't only recorded as an RGB or a black and white image, but it actually records also in infrared and many other, different satellites record in different spectral bands, what's called. But you can also, through looking at these different types of optical kind of registrations, you can look at features from, let's say, vegetation. The vegetation emits through photosynthesis, emanates specific types of wavelengths of light. Filtering those out or accentuating them in the satellite image, you can then detect where there was vegetation, where there now isn't, if you do it before and after, and where there are also earth disturbances. So using this before and after through satellite spectral analysis, you can then highlight places where there was any type of shifting in the earth itself and the vegetation, colorizing that, and then through the colorizing you get these hotspots. The red is just an aesthetic choice, so the tree doesn't come up as red necessarily. But that was using vegetation index to actually show where bones were falling. And through that to trace, to help locate, or help us locate our searches. We can also through that detect traces of where tanks left Israel and where they entered the Gaza Strip, how they the movement of the tank as it goes obviously leaves quite a lot of trails. So again, the remote sensing is actually operating as a kind of, and the Earth itself records different types of physical traces that then reflect back to the satellites in different ways, and you need to break it down in order to visualize. Can you tell me when I need to, in advance when I need to start looking after the Sure. Now, this form of imaging, and I skipped another Gaza case because I think it's going to be too long for now. But this mode of imaging is reactive in a way, because we use we gather the sources from on the ground and from satellites. But another mode of using this navigationality that I was mentioning earlier was to actually, there was a question of how can we actually create our own aerial imagery in places where it's either not available on the dates that we need. It's taken through means that we don't either aren't interested or can't tell the stories that we want to tell. Sometimes what the satellite or the aerial image can see is too expensive to acquire, and in cases of many populations, that's not an option to actually, either for financial reasons or for just being in a community living in precarious conditions. You can't really go to the States many times and say, I want satellite imagery or aerial imagery of my area, where you're actually kind of committing acts of human rights violations on me. And therefore, you sometimes need other forms of aerial imagery to supplant that. And in the case that we started in Israel, I started this in the north of the Negev. The Negev is the desert in the southern part of Israel. There have been for at least 300 years sedentary Bedouins from different tribes, different families, living in this whole region. Some of them were nomadic, some of them were still nomadic until the last century, really. But many were living sedentary lives, having cultivation. Obviously, not a westernized type of inhabitants, so they weren't fully recognized as sedentary by the Ottomans and the British, but definitely since the founding of the State of Israel, they were basically, there was a very total process of land confiscation, dispossession, and then resettling and trying to kind of either displace or incorporate whoever wants to stay or could stay, incorporate them into the general population in Israel. But the Bedouin, several of these families try to, since the 70s, starts to push towards land rights, their own land rights and their own cultural rights, and began a process of in a way of return. So trying to return to their lands that were declared state lands. Sorry. So one of these villages is a village called El Abakib, right at the edge of the north of the Negev Desert. In 2010, this village that was considered illegal by the state was demolished for the first time since 1951. So it was set up again by the villagers, but then in 2010 it was demolished entirely. There were around 400 families in this village. And by the evening it was demolished completely. And the villagers on that day and on many days since immediately began to rebuild their village. It's now 145 times that this cycle repeated of demolishing and rebuilding. While that was going on, forests by the Jewish National Fund and the Israeli Land Administration was planted on all these lands surrounding the village. This forest is basically planted and kind of under this larger slogan of making the desert bloom and battling desertification and producing a kind of different types of agricultural experiments and tests by different universities in Israel, and the Beersheba University. But at the core of it, it's a forest that's as a placeholder for preventing further land use by the Bedouins. And while the process of planting this forest is going on, it's also, the landworks are basically scraping and burying any type of physical remain of the past archaeology, like wells, stone houses, whatever type of physical remain could have been there. So you have a displacement on the ground of the people, you have taking away of their land rights, and you have also, through legal processes, taking them away from the image or from the map. So due to their illegal status, and I mean, there's the village of El Akib specifically, but there's also 36 other villages who are of the same condition of the unrecognizability, and they're not recognized and they are illegalized by the state. And they don't appear on maps, they're not connected to electricity, to water, to any type of basic amenity that you expect a citizen to get. And from the satellite, this is Google, you can see traces of these, I don't know, these fingerprint-like, I don't know if you can see them on the, but all these are the forests basically that are being planted. And you have these dikes that are earthworks, you can see here. And then that stops the water as the fall of water. As rain falls, you plant the trees along these dikes and you can have some water in this relatively arid area of the desert. This is an example of wells that are being filled in as the landworks are going on. And this is what you see where the village name should appear. You basically see nothing. On Google Maps or whatever map that you want to look at in order to get to these places, they don't appear. On the satellite, due to Israel's request in 1997, the US Congress passed a law deteriorating or downgrading the satellite resolution of Israel and Palestine to around 2 meters per pixel, which is 4 times roughly the less clear than the standard resolution per pixel. And just to compare what you should be seeing, this is the same scale from above. So this is the cemetery of the Aturi family in El Akib. This is the same zoom level. Google and photographs that we took from a kite over the cemetery. So obviously you can understand when I say obfuscation through satellite imagery and what the state allows you to see or doesn't allow you to see. There's a combination of multiple forms of erasure through survey, through legal means, through satellites quality reduction, and through earthworks. So actually changing the landscape itself, what it holds, what it does, what it could tell you. And at the base of these claims put forward by the Bedouin families is that there is a continuity of presence, that they're not nomadic tribes that just arrived here at some stage during the 50s, invented their own community and started kind of burying their dead and trying to claim for land, but they actually existed there for a few hundreds of years and with their own land documents and different types of traces. And the project that we started was trying to, first of all, produce evidence for this continuity of presence and gathering testimonies, gathering images and different types of land records, reading historic aerial interpretation, which I'll show in a second, but then also producing our own aerial imagery. Because this is what you get when you go through the satellites. You can't even buy satellite imagery if you want to get it. It's all reduced in the quality. So I'm not only talking about the publicly available as in free, but I'm also talking about the stuff that you pay money for. So we set up a truth commission on the beginning of January 2016 with the families, with the organization of NGO called Hot, with Active Stills, which is an activist photographer activist group, Palestinian and Israeli, different type of, different family members, leaders, looking at everyone bringing in their different land documents, collecting oral testimony, maps, etc. And one of the sources that we looked at were Air Force images from 1945, so a few years before the founding of Israel. And as part of the survey of Palestine, which is, you have the date here, the title of the topographic image, the Palestine survey. But then you have a flight that's actually flew over our Kiev in 1945. And when we zoomed into the images, right at the edge of what you could actually detect in an aerial image, we could start seeing all these dens, all this amount of cultivation, the openings of wells. But you can't really see it as a well here, you just see it first now. But when you actually go on the ground and look at it, you see that this earth mound surrounds the opening of a well, which is just too small to be detected. Even in this type of, we see gardens, we see all this, like this entire region was full of inhabitants, both sedentary, you have the tents, you have stone houses, you have livestock, fields, and over 70% of this area was cultivated by Bedouins in terms of wheat, barley, different types of orchards, etc. This is before the state of Israel. And from there we started having kind of documents, testimonies, the aerial imagery to anchor everything on the ground. And then we started what we called the Ground Truth Project, which is a way to conduct a current aerial survey that combines this kind of low altitude aerial photography with on the ground archaeological or basically walking on the ground while the kites or the aerial survey is conducted over ground and making this connection between what the view from above can see and what we then know on the ground. Like the well that's you couldn't really detect just through the aerial image, there are many other features that unless you go on the ground itself, there's no way you can actually say this is this and this is that and this is this type of tree and this is etc. The graves themselves that started the cemetery had no headstones at those times. They were just little mounds of earth. And here you can not detect a little mound of earth. Anything you see is maybe a disturbance in the ground where a cemetery should be. And maybe like the NDVI in Gaza, you need some other tool to actually help you see what that earth disturbance could be, at least. If not is, then at least raise some doubt as to what it could be. And in order to do this aerial survey in a place where we couldn't fly drones and we couldn't order airplanes to do it for us, we used a collaboration with a researcher that I knew from the US. She's an Israeli researcher, the one we have there, called Hagit Keisam. And she's a member of Public Lab, which is a US citizen science organization that's around this event of the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, set up a methodology around citizen or DIY aerial mapping using kites and helium balloons, attaching small cameras to these balloons for kites, sending them up into the air. You start surveying bit by bit the terrain. And we were joined by members of different families. This is one of the leaders of the Rupi family, which is the largest family in the region. They worked with us for many days. He's one of the first land rights activists from the Bedouin community in Israel. And this is, again, we're walking as the kite is photographing. This is the line of the forest that's continuously kind of approaching and kind of taking over more and more land. And this is where the village was when, in the first video that you saw. So the demolitions of the actual houses, this is already ready for the forest. I mean, at this stage, this is 2 years ago. It's mostly already planted. And we turned, using these different images, this is an opening of a well. You see the line of the forest again. The camera is over here. And this camera is taking images in a time-lapse kind of fashion. So you have one image every 1 or 2 seconds. And from these images, we then didn't create a photo mosaic, but we used a process called photogrammetry, which is the process of extracting measurement from still images. And it's a bit similar to the dragon that I showed before with Yuan Zhan. So you have multiple perspectival viewpoints that then together form a 3D volumetric image of the place, or volumetric transcoding. So this is the same area. All the blue rectangles that you saw before are the individual cameras that constructed this. This is the opening of the well. And basically what you end up is basically a 3D environment that's geolocated, because you can georeference every piece of it. It retains, in evidentiary terms, it retains the source of each camera. Each point in this, this is the interior of a well, so we send cameras inside as well. We connect the aerial image from 200, 300, 400 meters above ground to images that are taken on the ground level and also underground. So you have this motion from aerial survey, and the dichotomy between aerial and ground imaging is actually fused here too. All these different viewpoints, or all the obliques, as in a way Paul Valida would call it, into one volumetric thing that you need to start navigating, from which you can then also extract some further information. So you can use these 3D models as situating devices through which you can then either inspect other forms of imagery. This is what I meant by the different location, the different viewpoints that constructed this image. This is what remains of a house of the Abusian family. Again, each one of these elements is georeferenced, scaled, positioned, There are multiple. I mean, there are hundreds of different individual scans combined together to create an entire region. And we treat this as a form of salvage archaeology, because all these places are about to not exist, unfortunately. And one of the ways to track this process is to scan, and not only scan once, but also scan every few months or every few years, to then be able to also conduct comparative studies. So to look at a well, to look at another scan of the well and see how much was filled in, how much the landscape was changed, how much. One of the things to look at the way that rivers are dammed in order to block water from arriving to different places where they would like to conduct agriculture. Land transformation that's drying up wells are still used by the community there. And so this another process that we're trying to do is what I was mentioning regarding the cemetery, of how do you actually produce this evidence towards continuity of presence in a place where you can hardly see anything, because the grave is really just a mound in most places. In the earlier graves, there are different years in this. And just examining aerial footage, you can, if you start from 1945, you can't really identify the cemetery. When we get to this stage, where you see pathways leading from the well, you can see different parts of fields, but you can't see graves, individual ones. So we actually, by georeferencing and putting one on top of the other, you can start tracking an individual grave and trying to see if there is any type of disturbance at the exact location of that, for instance, area here. And we go, I mean, there's more analysis that we've been doing since. This is the beginning of a kind of particular investigation that's hopefully going to be presented in courts later this year. It's part of a land rights trial, which is the first time that, I mean, our evidence is one of a few different experts, both historians, geographers, the actual individual members of the community that for the first time are actually having the opportunity to give testimony to the courts, which is, it took them almost 50 years to get there, because the proceedings really started in the early 70s. Their ability to petition to claim for their land. And now it's the first time that they actually get a chance to speak in court, which is incredible. But yeah, so evidence is being, or the testimony is being compiled for that specifically, and where the entire system or the different types of media that we've gathered are being collected also into basically a 3D GIS platform. So if usually mapping platforms are, or ways that you interact with satellite imagery or aerial imagery are in the way that you're used to in Google, which is basically using XY coordinates and zoom in or out. If you scan an environment information on that, you don't really have the opportunity to interact with that model spatially. You can't go into a well, for instance, on Google Earth. It doesn't have that possibility. In order to plot the information in three-dimensional manner, we have to actually kind of write bits of code to do that. So that is another project of bringing the three-dimensional model into a GIS platform in which we can then bring some of the claiming plots that are under recorded claims to locate some of the testimony, some of the mapping information, but also the knowledge that comes from the community itself. So we bring together different types of perspectives, which are not only the Western hegemonic kind of way of mapping, but also the lived knowledge from the grounds and the types of associations that are part of that. Time for another project or where are we? I have no idea where we are.
We have like 5 more minutes for the question.
5 more minutes, okay. So I'll just hint towards the project that came out of this last year. Basically, we were looking, we were approached by a Yazidi organization called Yazda, who's an NGO set up mainly by Yazidi diaspora, starting in 2014 when the genocide by ISIS was taking place in the north of Iraq, around the Sinjar mountain area. And this entire region, which is over here, roughly, so, well, you see where it is. This is Mount Sinjar, which is roughly 80 kilometers wide. It's just on the border with Syria. And all this region was basically swept by ISIS in 2014 in August. And since then until around 2017, ISIS were controlling the entire region. They have since obviously been pushed back, but around 500,000 Yazidi are still displaced along the Syrian border, with this, basically this entire region still in its Yazidi villages, deserted, full of mass graves, and destroyed temples, destroyed, I mean, there's around 3,000 Yazidi women are still somewhere in captivity. There are multiple, I mean, we don't know the numbers of children that are still held captive, but we're approached by USTA to basically help them document or assist their documentation team in ways of documenting on the ground before any type of official investigation can actually unfold, because the area is so precarious. None of the official bodies are sending people in, so the UN takes years to send an investigator. There's still fights between the Iraqi government, the Kurdish government, the Kurdish representatives, different warlords in the region, etc. So on the ground you have still tens and perhaps hundreds of mass graves just laying open. And you have houses that are, the evidentiary value of these locations are, if not gone, then deteriorating rapidly. And you have organizations like Yazda going on the ground independently trying to report, but they need ways to actually do that. Aside from taking photos and taking videos and interviewing survivors, etc. So, I'll speak through this and we can talk about it during the questions. But we started looking at moving the negative kind of methodology of kind of citizen mapping to through a process of training. Please skip this and we can go back to it later. We actually trained, I met with myself and another researcher called Caine from Architecture. We met with a group of Yazda documentation researchers from Duhok, Iraq. We met them in Turkey, did a pretty extensive kind of workshop for around a week. And basically training them in how to conduct aerial survey, mostly because satellites didn't give this type of resolution on the one hand that we needed on the ground. Many times you couldn't approach the site safely because places were booby trapped and you didn't know what necessarily you're walking into. And therefore you need a very low kind of pretty discrete way of surveying from the air and then extracting from that a model that can be investigated or analyzed off-site. And we used mostly drones in this case because it was already possible. They had enough political connections on the ground to enable that. And then again, this process of scanning on the ground, comparing to this is in the case of destroyed temples all across the region. Skip this again. This is one of the scans of the sites. The Yazidi shrines have these conical sun-like shapes on the top of them. They worship. The sun is a dominant feature in their religion, so all the shrines and mausoleums have different types of spires. The tops of these spires were one of the first things that ISIS blew off when they arrived in each place. And some of these temples were also either kill sites that people were put inside the temples and then blown up. And none of these were investigated before in a way. So you have this type of documentation is a way to kind of take a bit of the site out of Sinjar and then be able to look at blast patterns, look at kind of possible reconstructions, possible ways of reconstruction, analysis on what's underneath perhaps. This is a bit of a reconstruction that we did using some historic footage. So Sal is kind of trying to piece back together what things look like. And on the whole, the project there, which the temples are first phase in it, were a way to actually kind of have different types of sites recorded in as much of a great detail materially, which then trying to use the material evidence, bring it together with the testimony taken from different survivors from these locations, map them on, and do the kind of classic GIS work of spatially mapping events, kind of showing trajectories, using spatial analysis to conduct or to kind of highlight different connections between space-time connections between different events, being able to track a lot of the violence that's been happening there was, for instance, ISIS arrive at the village, they kill off the men, but then the women are taken, divided up, and taken to multiple locations. And then you have each testimony is actually moves in space and time. So a woman can be taken from one place, sold to someone, to an ISIS fighter in a different city, abused there, you have the sites, and then she's moved the dates, and then scan the sites in which these women were located and remodel them, sometimes try and extract from that pieces of evidence that corroborates some of the oral testimonies. But then in other cases, like in our Sibnaya project, which I don't know if some of you saw with the Syrian prison reconstruction, the architectural model can actually be used as part of the actual event of giving testimony. It's something that we're also, to the different way we're using in the investigation in the Grenfell fire, and there are a few places where we're kind of using that method, obviously with supervision of psychologists and trauma experts. But I think to conclude, it's the view from above, on the one hand, is a tool of the state, or is controlled many times by states, corporations, etc. And it's not a view, it's a view that we've grown more accustomed to seeing through over the years, through different, maybe through Google, I think. But as a kind of civic perspective, both for indigenous communities, but also for any one of us, it's a tool that could be mobilized either as existing knowledge through its intersection with other forms of modeling, imaging, testimony collection, etc., but also through actual production of our own types of aerial perspectives, and understanding also that this dichotomy between the view from above and the view from the ground are not really as distinct anymore. They're increasingly moving into a kind of fusion that's spatial and navigational. And yeah, I'm trying to, hopefully this offers a glimpse into the type of, into the types of kind of communities of practice that could be formed around different spatial and imaging practices. Thanks.
Thank you, Ariel, for this presentation. And, I think we can understand a little bit better what are the implications of Ariel vision nowadays and who their actors are and how it can be used in order to reconstruct events and in order to assess responsibility and assess the possible futures. So for now, we're going to take some questions. If anyone has any questions for Ariel, yeah, okay, I'm going to start.
I think a chair.
Sorry?
I think a chair.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yes. If you don't mind.
First, I just wanted to say there's an exhibition with Jeff Caine in the White Mason Yard, and he did in Israel, second country Israel, and asking him to do the of the nomadic people against the in deserts, against the background, and they live on land, they sleep on land, and they move about, and they have that agriculture. So it's the same landscape. On the background is this state-of-the-art sort of building, if you wonder what it is. And it's a high-security prison keeping the Palestinians who they think are terrorists, blah, blah, blah. So you have the Palestinians in the prison, and then you have this other nomadic that they don't mind, but they're sort of wandering, sort of sleeping on the ground. So it's at the Mason Yard, White Cubes. Great photograph.
Yeah.
It's only one thing in Israel. And the question is, where did you get the name from? I remember I came across it at ICA. It was just one day screening. Maybe it was 2 years ago. Forensic architecture.
Architecture or the?
Yeah, forensic architecture.
Where did the name come from?
Yeah.
It was, I don't know which one of the members pointed, but the name comes from forensic architecture. It started as a research project, European Research Council project. Part of the Center for Research Architecture department in Goldsmiths University. And it was a project led by Ariel Weitzman. Ariel Weitzman, who's the head of forensic architecture at the time, was also the head of Center for Research Architecture. And Ariel was working for some time around the notion of forensic aesthetics, or this combination of a different understanding of aesthetics as this type of material sensor, and not just this remote. I mean, obviously there are multiple histories and interpretations and philosophical understandings of what aesthetics mean and where to, and his and it grew larger than that. Understanding of aesthetics was going back to pre-Kantian kind of understandings on the one hand, but also reading from Michael Benjamin, into the kind of political agency that you find within the object and the image, and reading into the text by Benjamin talking about the crack, for instance, and how within the crack you can understand that there's an event, a political event in that space, and he took it to not only that, but he was talking about the crack, the architectural element of the crack as showing as a manifestation of the different forces on the building, and expanding from that to read into any entire environments, into kind of everything from the bone to a person, or Mengele's skull, for instance, is one example.
Sure.
And then you take aesthetics as a sensor, and you have forensics and forensics as summoning a form through which to discuss politically as a kind of group of people in a public manner to discuss this evidence. And that connection was made between aesthetics and forensics, and in particular, architecture was the prism through which the entire department was working through, and therefore I imagine, I mean, I was not there at the time, but the using architecture to conduct forensics.
There was even sound which they used as a form of architecture. The sound of bullets, what bullets they were using in the sort of flopper or
Yeah, yes, yeah.
yeah. You remember that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it doesn't contain itself only to imagery. I mean, it's this. Yeah, Lawrence Abu Hamdan was, in his own work and his own PhD research in the department specifically, but also together with forensic architecture. And as part of the project, it was a project combining multiple PhD students in the department, each one with their own kind of aesthetic and kind of research.
But it's all under forensic architecture, isn't it? Yeah. So architecture, as you described, that crack doesn't, the architecture as you described it, is unnecessary. It's not necessarily a building. Yeah. This is great. Thanks.
Hi. So I just want to say thanks for that. Because I felt like I knew a reasonable amount about forensic architecture from what I've seen, and I know Lawrence Abu Hamdan's work very well, and saw the ICO show. But I think this just gave an incredible. Sorry.
You did see the tournament.
Oh, I did see that as well, of course, yeah, most recently. I think this talk just gave such an incredible insight into the amount of labour and work that goes into sort of these projects. And yeah, just sort of thanks for the presentation, thanks for that work, because in a way, the thing I've been thinking about in relation to this is that you've made very clear that it is predominantly corporations that own the area of view, obviously Google predominantly. And in some respects, this is sort of, when you think about private ownership, there isn't the same kind of recourse or kind of what checks and measures and balances that you can be brought against them in the way that sort of public ownership can, because public ownership it would be us that own these kind of perspectives or views. There's a sense of accountability that we can control that you can't in the face of dominance or anyone in the corporation has ownership. So in a way, I feel like it's been made clear that forensic architecture is work that's done on behalf of publics to kind of reconstitute and remake these things in quite almost dispositional ways, so evaluating what's needed and then reconstructing it with the tools that are available. And rather than being totally oppositional to these corporations, they're more kind of discrepant or slyly kind of interrogating these infrastructures and rebuilding them to serve the same purpose and offer this recourse on our behalf. So that's an amazing thing. So I guess my question is in two parts. In light of that, who do you find is supporting your work financially, and kind of how do you kind of gain that kind of financial support and funding? And the second part is, does that ever come into question when it's used as testimony, kind of the ulterior motives or the ethics behind how these things are funded and supported? Is this ever kind of brought up in sort of someone trying to refute your evidence or this work as evidence?
Yeah, first of all, thanks. I'm happy that made that clear, and thank you for saying that. In terms of the funding, we try to be very careful who we take money from and how things are. There's no way to not get tainted as well by this. There's no avoiding. Obviously, you don't take money from. We don't work for government. We don't work directly for governments, for corporations. We work for civil society. And that's a prerequisite for taking on money and for taking on the case. There are many places where arts, a lot of times exhibitions and our whole involvement in the art world is actually funding investigations. That's our I don't know if our main way, kind of way of operating, because the academic grants as well are huge kind of sources of funding, like the ERC that set this whole project up. I mean, that's the European Research Council kind of money that's obviously tied to, it's tied to the institutions, and there's no avoiding that. But we try and use our investigations and our exhibitions and our kind of public presence, increasing public presence, to also kind of gain access to funds. So all our investigations, all our exhibitions are not, I mean, the work is not sold as art to be sold on, but the money for producing a show is directly funding research.
Yeah.
And that's relating to any type of public engagement that we have. Money goes into funding. In cases like, let's say the Whitney Biennale, where there was a lot of questioning of whether to participate, for instance, or not. We in the end decided to shift the whole investigation towards Warren Counter and this corporation's involvement in the human rights violations that we're investigating in Gaza.
I mean,
so the actual product was, shown in the Biennale, tried to show the complicity of the same museum with the kind of subject of our investigation and the direct connection that it has on violence against people.
Yeah.
In terms of if it interferes with our giving testimony, for instance, then yes, it does. There are cases where we couldn't go on with cases because we were, in terms of being part of legal proceedings, because we were just posed as our public profile, and our public profile within the context of art was about to create too much of a mess for anyone involved. We're definitely discredited for it, but we try and produce as solid as evidence as we can, and then whoever's needs to contend with it needs to, I mean, say, okay, we're artists, but what do you say about what we show you here? Then that's, at some stage, usually it's kind of, it's a way to, even if we're not fully accepted, it's a way to tease out more information, or to tease out the response. Because one of the things that we constantly, I mean, that both states and corporations have is this ability to either neither confirm nor deny, I mean, that line of defense, or just ignore. Or kind of obfuscate through throwing at you tons of evidence or tons of material and just letting you kind of waste months in trying to, you have the Panama Papers as a kind of very old kind of example of that. And Hannah Arendt actually writes about this kind of obfuscation through just abundance of knowledge, which is, I mean, analog type of knowledge still, but and in a way, what we're trying to constantly do is to use these networks and different types of media and different types of sensibilities to actually sift through this amount of information, locate it in space and time, and form narratives that can then produce further evidence, but also produce further questions that could be thrown back to whoever was kind of trying to deny.
I mean, I think my question wasn't intended to sort of scrutinise your ethics or your position, but actually, no, sure, but in a way, my question was more kind of trying to sort of point out and the other ways in which the big dominant corporations and who hold the power essentially are able to weaponize that against you by kind of discrediting, refuting, refusing. And also people, not really about who you choose to receive funding from, but who actually chooses to fund you, in that, it would be difficult to get the state to fund you because they're the people that are putting sanctions on the resolutions, and corporations usually allied to things like Google, and people that have access to this technology obviously wouldn't want to fund you. So it's more about you're battling these sort of hegemonic things on many fronts in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tightrope. I mean, we try, I mean, I'll keep it short, but and just one example for that is that when we were investigating bombings by the US, or by Russia, sorry, in Syria, like the RT were constantly kind of drilling about the fact that we were US and European kind of agents basically trying to, undermine the Assad regime and then kind of implicate Syria and Russia in the process. But then we were also, at the same time, also investigating US bombings of mosques and places in Syria. And that was kind of also could be brought to an extent to counter that. Maybe not to persuade RT, but we try to kind of investigate everyone as much as possible. Not that that's necessarily the criteria, but we're definitely not aware of the fact that if we only investigate one side, it's going to be harmful.
I just wanted to ask, as well as your role in speaking truth to power or pursuing a certain kind of investigative project, I was very interested in the ways in which the kind of work that you do does generate pieces that have a really powerful aesthetic, visual interest, and what you make of that aspect of your work, the sense that this technology and imagery that you're generating through it is producing kind of a stream of imagery and representation that is very exciting to look at and sometimes beautiful to look at. And so it's a very powerful kind of aesthetic experience, and that must be part of its appeal, power, and why you do get nominated for certain prizes, alongside your investigative work. And also the kind of topics that you'll be choosing also lend themselves to narrative frameworks that we're used to through to watching investigative or documentary films of a particularly compelling nature. So I just wondered what you make of this relationship between your investigative work and the aesthetics of this new technology, and I suppose the narrative potential power of these kinds of investigative journeys to truth, which we're familiar with through detective fiction or certain kinds of filmmaking.
I mean, aesthetics is part of, as hopefully, I mean, to an extent I managed to elucidate. There shouldn't really be a distinction between the aesthetics of the image and the investigation itself. I mean, they're part and parcel of the same thing, because the investigation is the material through which we investigate is the media itself, and and our analysis of that media is part of a long chain of events that media has been going through. And obviously the types of technologies that we both use and develop are used in order to kind of facilitate us with new tools to actually speak, in a way, speak out our investigation and speak out the knowledge that is within that media. So I mean, the media doesn't speak for itself ever. You need to make it talk, and you need to make it talk with other forms of media, other forms of non-human, human, environmental, and kind of types of narratives. Now, among other things, and kind of integral to the way that we work, is that we are also image makers and practitioners. I myself am an artist and trained as a photographer, and then and this is the language that I use. I'm not like a textual person. For me, investigating the materiality of what constitutes an image and how does photography change once the medium is not an image that's kind of flattened onto pixel, kind of a plane of pixels, but it's actually forming a spatial entity. And how do you navigate that entity? What can it see? What can it not see? How does it represent? How does it record? And how do you then kind of use it to kind of further that kind of knowledge what you're trying to show as a documentarist, as an investigator. These are things that are part of what excite us, intrigue us, and all of us, whatever discipline we come from, and we come from multiple different disciplines. The way we try to anchor things in order for, and hopefully we manage most of the times not to do that, which is to get fascinated by our own imagery, or creates a kind of image pornography, is that we try and, on the one hand, in a very simple level, not to show things like acts of violence or acts of, unless it's absolutely, there's no other way around it. So, and if you go through our imagery, you won't see, 99% of the cases, you won't see all these images. And that's exactly for that. I mean, we're trying to avoid kind of specularization of that act of violence. On the other hand, there are things that need to be shown. And you have, on the one hand, issues of consent and kind of chain of consent of all the people involved, from the actual communities of people that have been affected, through the people who produce the images, to kind of fair warning if it needs to be given to the audience. But at the heart of it, and that's maybe concluding, is that any type of aesthetic decision is guided by a kind of, I'd say, a kind of a backbone or a kind of spine that is what actually drives the investigation, the narrative further. And if there is a justification for doing a aesthetic or image move to show that, then you do it. If it's not, then it's noise, basically. And I think along the way, moving from a single image to the image to another concept that was developed early on by who's now the head of departments in the Goldsmiths, Susan Shukley, about the material witness. There are different concepts that we kind of, different members formed through their own research, but also through the group. The material witness, the architectural image complex, the operational model, drawing on Swarovski. There are different types of conceptual kind of understandings of media that were kind of developed throughout the 10 years now of forensic architecture almost, to better deal with the changing media landscape, with different politics around it, and how the different capabilities of using that media to drive investigation. But that's also conceptually interesting for image makers. As like separated from the investigation to an extent, it's also their kind of medium, or kind of, on a conceptual level, it's there are kind of understandings that different members kind of arrived at with regards to our the material that we're using.
I think we're going to, because we have this room until up to 3:30. We can move this discussion maybe to Chelsea Space if you want to go and visit the exhibition at the same time, and then we can maybe all meet together right now.
I mean, how many more questions? I mean, there's you. Maybe that's the last one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm curious if you could speak about who you imagine yourself producing this knowledge for, and how that shapes the practice. And I think in particular, to hear you speak about the relationship to a state or interstate organization, which is one way this sounds like it's an oppositional project, and at the same time, there's a sense that it's kind of inhabiting the same kind of perspectives or spaces, if that makes sense. That the state is also interested
of the hegemony.
Mhm.
That we're inhabiting the same space as some of our subjects of inquiry.
Mhm.
I think, first of all, all the cases are done on behalf of and with someone on the ground, someone who's directly connected to to the issues. And most of the times, we're also, people leading the investigations are either from the region, part of the problem or part of the solution, and kind of have a kind of intimate connection with the subject of inquiry themselves, whichever side of the is Israeli. And with the Bedouin case, I mean, there's a very kind of clear connection for me as a Jewish Israeli person leading a project on behalf of a Bedouin community against the state of Israel. And not only against the state of Israel, I mean, there are also kind of, it's not only oppositional, not regarding the state, but there are positive or kind of constructive issues regarding memory and kind of documentation that are internal and have nothing to do directly with opposing the state or going to trial against the state, etc. But there are many cases that's, whether it's in Greece, in Colombia, in Mexico, definitely now in Britain, in Germany. Each one of these places, there are members of the team that have some direct connection, and there are families that are either asking us to do work, and I kind of forgot the question, but then yes, there is like increasingly we're becoming, the profile is going up, and obviously we're appearing in the case, we're appearing in ICA, we're appearing in these different forums that are problematic, and I think we're refusing a lot of things because of these reasons. Obviously, it's not in the public domain, but not everything we accept and not every forum we attend. And in order to avoid some of these things, it's always been a university project. I mean, it started from the heart of, publicly funded, government supported, kind of, we're based in Goldsmiths still. But I mean, I think to sum it up in short is that we're trying to use our privileges in ways that can be mobilized where other people don't have those privileges. So again, if I use the Israeli kind of side of things, I as an Israeli can ask things from the state, can do things and can say things that Bedouin cannot. And that goes for any type of scenario. And sometimes when you come and acknowledge your position, as long as it is kind of acknowledged and kept kind of public, and you have enough people reminding you to kind of to keep yourself in check, or people that keep you in check, that could be productive to the investigation. I'm not saying it's always going to be successful, but it's a way. There's no way to avoid. If you want to actually enact change, you can't completely disengage. You need to kind of drill into the institutions, and you need to sometimes use your connections within them to give you more power in a way.
Thank you.